Awesome. Everybody looks back in their seats. So we'll go ahead and start. So this next section we're going to start off with is how marginalized identities intersect with mental illness and police treatment. All right, so on the next slide we have our own working definitions because we want to make sure everybody's on the same page. We have our own working definitions of what marginalized and intersectional mean. So for us, we started with marginalized as relegated to an unimportant or powerless position within a society or group. And for intersectional, we have a term coined by Kimberly Crenshaw, initially applied to feminism, now in a broader context refers to how oppression is experienced in various configurations and in various intensities by the same person or group. Now, these are just working definitions, right? So they're not static, and we recognize that these definitions change, especially for different people. But would anybody else like to add anything to either of these definitions or modify these in any way? No? Okay. All right, so what are some of these different identities? All right, we're going to go back to listing some of these out from the crowd. What are some of these different identities that could intersect with mental illness and influence treatment by the police? And we're thinking more so along the lines of like, how do, say, different race, class, how do these different identities kind of impact how police treatment and mental illness relate? Back there. Excuse me? The homeless. So impoverished, poverty.
What your first language is other than English?
First language, if it's other than English. So yeah. Immigration status. Right, so we have different people of different race, different class, different age, geography, ability, gender, sexuality, in the way back. LGBTQ, income, even your type of work. These things all intersect, right? And that's what we're talking about when we say somebody of working class, Asian, undocumented, like how these different things relate. So why do we want to be cognizant of these different identities when we're talking about mental illness and police treatment?
We don't want to assume that everyone experiences interaction with the police in the same way.
Right. We don't want to assume that people receive police treatment in the same way, right? All right. Yeah. That's. And then we're going to pass it off to Shannon. She's going to share some important statistics.
Okay, so the research that I was able to find that we're kind of aware of doesn't tend to talk about or target marginalized groups as they intersect with their interactions with police. So I've found things on, gender and race and sexuality, but not race and sexuality or gender and race together. So if people are aware of that type of research in terms of especially negative interactions with law enforcement, we'd be really interested. We're going to have a little kind of eval thing on your scratch paper towards the end, and so if you can steer us in that direction, we'd love to incorporate those things into the training. But what we do have is that 33 to 50% of people killed by law enforcement have some type of disability. And disability is broad here. It's physical, medical, mental health, developmental, especially leaning towards autism. And so these examples are, everything from people who had diabetes and seizure disorders, Sandra Bland, one good example, epilepsy and depression. And so it can go all the way to, of course, mental illnesses and things like that. When disability is reported by law enforcement after a shooting or a fatality, which is not often from what I was able to find, but when it is, 87% of those reports involve mental illness or developmental disability, more specifically autism, which is pretty staggering. But we were kind of discussing beforehand that it's sort of to their benefit, to their advantage, to maybe not report that a person had some type of disability if there is a shooting or a fatality, because of course that would garner more attention and more scrutiny of the interaction. And people with mental health issues are 16 times more likely to be killed by law enforcement in a police interaction than people without mental health issues. So just something to consider, with regard to Maria's story and the other stories that we talked about, that that decision to make that phone call to call the police, while possibly well-intentioned, makes it 16 times more likely that the person might be killed by law enforcement than if we choose not to call the police at that point. So.
Right, and so a few other things we want to also keep in mind when we're talking about intersecting identities, mental health, and police treatment is how we pathologize different identities, right? And when we say pathologize, does anybody know what we mean by that? Diagnosing. So our tendency to essentially represent something as a disease, right? A disease, or to represent something as a psychologically unhealthy or abnormal, something that isn't necessarily so. And so how this relates is that we oftentimes pathologize feminine behavior as hysterical, right? And then we have transphobia and homophobia and various queer identities that were historically pathologized by the DSM. And actually, Shannon, would you mind sharing what the DSM,
The DSM stands for Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, and it is the book, the reference that mental health professionals use to give diagnoses and codes, more specifically, to folks who seek treatment for mental health issues. A lot of it is related to what insurance will and will not pay for, and how people kind of get diagnosed that way. But when you hear people reference it, the reason we talk about it here is that up until not quite, I think 30 years ago, give or take, homosexuality was diagnosed as a mental illness, a mental disorder. So, it continues to change as society continues to change, but it's just something to keep in mind in terms of what are we diagnosing and pathologizing with that manual.
Right, and so one other thing to also point out is how sex workers are stigmatized for experiencing trauma from sexual assault, and how that translates to be more likely to being detained or brutalized by police, right? And so briefly, we wanted to also touch on inaccessibility issues for treatment and services. Specifically here in Chicago, some information. Since the 1960s, the number of beds in Illinois state-run psychiatric hospitals has decreased to fewer than 1,500 from 35,000. The latest closures were in 2012, including the Tinley Park Center, and that coincided with Chicago shuttering half of its 12 mental health clinics. In this way, mental health has been effectively criminalized. Conservative estimates suggest that 1/3 of the 10,000 inmates in custody suffer from serious mental illnesses. Jails and prisons serve as the largest mental health institutions in 44 states, and additionally, 10 times as many mentally ill individuals are currently incarcerated as are residing in state hospitals. And we say this because mental health is being further criminalized, not to suggest pathologize folks with mental health, right, as inherently criminal or anything like this. But Shannon, would you mind also sharing? So you were going to touch on something? The 2.5 times.
Right. The statistics show us that people with mental health issues are 2.5 times more likely to actually be victims of crime than they are to be perpetrators. And that's something that's really important to keep in mind. Maria's story, for example, she was seeking help from the police, and it turned into an arrest situation. And that's not uncommon, actually. People who maybe are homeless and have schizophrenia get assaulted or robbed, and they go to the police for help. And that turns into an arrest situation because they're acting crazy, quote unquote, or whatever it might be. So the idea being that having a mental health issue isn't a crime, but involving the police when there's some sort of mental health crisis going on, or when somebody has been a victim of a crime and they just happen to have a mental health issue, that suddenly gets turned into a criminal situation where the person with the mental illness is put in jail. And so it's just something that we really want to stress, is that most often the reason people with mental health issues are coming into contact with law enforcement is because they are a victim of a crime or they need some type of assistance, but the mental health issue becomes predominant and gets turned into something that's criminalized.
Right. Thank you, Shannon. And yeah, so again, just to reiterate, as somebody mentioned before, we have these different oppressive systems, and we draw these stats and conclusions to kind of point out how these lack of resources, right, and inaccessibility translate to how are we dealing with these problems? And the numbers show that we're just relying on prisons, right, and policing, as opposed to providing more resources or opening up more facilities and providing more resources. Yeah.
In the 60s, when deinstitutionalization started, where there was sort of this push because we had new medications and treatments available to kind of get people out of these really, really large state-run institutions that were horrible places for people to be living. The idea was that the money we were spending there, which was actually more expensive than taking care of folks in the community, the money was supposed to follow the person into the community, but because we are a capitalist government full of old white dudes, the money did not follow the people into the community. And so now we have all these folks in the community who, they do need services and help, but the frontline responders for that have become by default the police, because they're the people who can, like, they respond when you call a certain phone number and people just sort of default to it, like somebody said before. And I think that's really important to remember, is like, these are people out there just kind of trying to oftentimes just make it and get by with this huge lack of services, especially here in the Chicago area, and that's not on them. That's on the fact that the money didn't kind of follow the people out. And so the police become first line responders, they respond, and then we wind up with the Cook County Jail, which is the largest mental health facility in the country. So that just kind of tells you where we're at and why we really want to stress alternatives to getting the police involved when people need assistance. And I think we're due for another break here, because we're going to kind of move to the point where we're talking about de-escalation and coping strategies and things, so we want to give people a chance to regroup. So do you have a question?
Yeah, I have a question about whether at any point today you're going to talk about the training or lack of training that police are given to handle mental health emergencies.
I can speak to that right now if you guys want me to. Like I was saying before, 5 hours are required in police academy. 5, just the 5, not 50 or 500, just 5, just the 5. And that's required. And it varies how that gets delivered based on who's running the police academy. And then every year, 1 hour on special populations. But special populations can mean anything from the elderly to people with physical disabilities to mental illness. And actually part of my job, I work for a nonprofit agency that serves people with disabilities. And part of my job is actually to offer free training to first responders in the communities where we have homes and programs. And I write them letters and I say, we'll come out and we'll do this and it'll be free and no cost to you, and I can stay for 3 hours and here I am and let's talk about this. And crickets for the most part. We do have some communities who respond, but then you're in a room full of people that are kind of giving you the body language and looking at you like, tell me why I should care about this, tell me something I don't know already. You have the rare kind of gem in the room, but otherwise, and so they really take me up on it because it's free and they can say, okay, that's our special populations training for the year. So that's your kind of basic. And then if you have departments that want to train CIT officers, the crisis intervention team officers, there's no standard for that either. If they're going to be fully trained, they do 40 hours. There is a curriculum, and I actually was involved in like the pilots here in Chicago and kind of helping write that and make sure the information getting presented was accurate. And they do some role playing and things like that. But you don't have to do the 40 hours to say that you CIT trained your officers. You can shorten it to 6 hours or 8 hours, 1 day, 2 days, whatever you can sort of afford in the department or whoever you can get in to do the training. So it is a hodgepodge would be the word that I would use to describe it. And it really depends on if they have somebody assigned to training, how many people in their area that they serve, how big of a problem is it. I mean, I've gone to, I'll just call them out. I've gone to like Wilmette and like Northbrook and stuff, and you know, it isn't up in their face every day, and so it's maybe not as, you know, big of a priority for them, I would guess. So I don't know if that answers your question. I'm sorry I don't actually have an answer for you because there's not really this sort of standard requirement. So, but then again, you can train people for 40 hours to be a CIT officer, and you still send them out there, and they're still a police officer, and they still have a gun, and you know, and they still maybe don't even have the temperament to be doing that kind of interaction and work with people, even with their 40 hours of CIT training. So we don't know what we're going to get, which is part of the risk of calling the police. So
So the answer is training is almost zero.
right. Even though at least 1 in 10 calls are with a person, emotionally disturbed person. And I've actually trained undergraduate, college level officers that are trying to, you know, get their graduate degree to get promoted, and they tell me that it's 5 hours in their training, and it's easily 50% of their time that they spend on calls. That was here in Chicago. So it's very disproportionate, I think was the word I was looking for earlier. Very disproportionate. So, other questions?
Do you know of any police departments that do more training, and has that been proven to be effective? I mean, I know in Ferguson they were talking about restructuring the
I don't personally. I don't know if anybody else can speak to that. I just know that I did a lot of research for my graduate thesis on CIT, and so that's kind of where, you know, my perspective is coming from on it. It's not a panacea. It doesn't. They want it to say like, oh, we have CIT officers, that solves the problem, and it's only one part of a system, and if the whole system doesn't work, then it doesn't work, even if you have the properly trained officers. So.
Will the flaw of this CIT training would be, let's say, if you get majority of people trained in Chicago to be in a CIT unit, but then can like the police also dispatch the unit to certain areas within Chicago, and if they dispatch CIT in only, let's say, UIC or the north side would still be a problem, because basically the police could pick and choose where
Right.
they be dispatched,
Right.
as opposed to sending them various units.
Right. Yeah, definitely want to speak to that. I don't want, and I think we don't want people walking away today and think about, oh, like, wouldn't it be amazing if cops were trained on de-escalation and all this, because that just means more money for the police, which can turn into like just BS training. And so the bottom line here is not training officers to be counselors and to de-escalate. The idea is to train ourselves on de-escalation, because the bottom line is that police, their first job is to enforce the law, and if with necessary force if needed. And you can see, we've talked about the stories about how that plays out in real life when you have people with guns, and their first purpose is to enforce the law. So again, we don't want people walking away with like, oh, you know, we should advocate for more funding for the police so that they can be fully trained and receive all the hours for training, because that's not their purpose. And so we're here to imagine the structures that we can build up so that we don't have to rely on people with guns to de-escalate situations.
You can train them all you want, but they're still police.
Right. We should be advocating for more funding for the people who are supposed to be doing this. So we're in services. So I think we're about to take a 5-minute break so we can regroup. And so this next session is going to be, okay, what are we talking about? Alternatives to the police. So we're going to dive deep into what that is.